This idea of the soul. It's fascinating to me because over the past couple of weeks, I want to say this, that we started this series a couple of weeks ago, and those of you that maybe haven't been here for all of it or any of it, I encourage you maybe catch up at some point and listen. But we started this series, and I'll just confess that so much of why we're doing this has had to do with where I am personally, and just some things that I've been walking through the last few months and realizing like maybe this is something we all should think about. And truly, very, very sincerely, 2 weeks ago when we first kicked into this, there was a part of me that just thought, very sincerely, I thought, man, I hope this makes sense to someone other than just me. I hope that when I stand up here, that I make sense. And what's been fascinating over the past couple of weeks is how much sense it seems to be making. And I'm finding myself just throughout the week and in my conversations with friends and family members and acquaintances, like it just seems like anyone I'm coming into contact with, this conversation about the soul and what we're experiencing and what we're talking about with our souls and what they really mean. It's really revealed to me just the truth of what we said in the beginning, and that's the soul is something that is so essential, so necessary in our lives, so much something that we need to pay attention to, and yet we find ourselves living in a place because of our busyness and because of our culture and because of our orientation, just being Western individuals, we don't ever think or talk about the soul, and so we've just been learning things, and I think it reveals just the fact that we need to learn things. I was kind of laughing this week because I was thinking about some of the discoveries for some people. I remember, years ago I was talking about the gospel, and I had somebody literally say to me, well, I always thought the gospel was just a style of, gospel was a style of music. And I think through this series, we're discovering that soul is more than just a style of music, right? Like, it's not just something that you listen to. And in fact, soul isn't even something that allows you to play music. That's something we call funk. And that's a totally different thing, right? Like funk is not soul. That's not what we're talking about in this series, right? Like soul is something else. Soul is something that every one of us have. Like we hear this in our culture. Sometimes people say something about a certain individual. They may say, well, he or she, they have no soul. And what we're seeing in this series is that if you're human, if you're breathing, if you're alive, you have a soul, right? Like everybody has a soul. A soul is something that nobody can take from you. Now, what we've also been seeing is that doesn't mean you can't lose your soul, but we've been looking at that even from a very different perspective. Oftentimes in the past, we think about losing our soul the way that we lose a tooth as a child, right? Like you lose your tooth as a child and you just kind of say goodbye to it, right? Like I hope I get some cash for that. It'd be nice if mom and dad would belly up and, give me some income. But it's gone, right? What we've been looking at is the fact that our souls, when we lose our souls, even when Jesus uses that sort of terminology, that very frequently he's not referring to some sort of cosmic destination like we lose our soul and it's gone and now you're going to land in this place. But more often it's a sort of present tense diagnosis of our status. We're living in a lost sense. It's not like losing a tooth. It's more like losing your keys. Right? You know the difference, like what that feels like? Like when you walk in the house and you put your keys somewhere and you go back to get them and they're gone and you know that you put them there, right? Like who moved the keys? And you don't know who moved the keys, but you're convinced somebody did because you remember. And what makes it even worse is that usually you discover that you lost your keys when? When you need them, right? When do we discover that we've lost our souls? When we need them. There's this sense, like our souls are something that when we lose our soul, when we're living in that disconnected sort of space, there's something about our own lives that we acknowledge that there's something missing. And it's not like just gone for good. It's just like, I misplaced it. I'm off. I need to go. There's a necessity to it. There's this awkwardness to it. The soul is something that is far bigger and far more important than how our culture or even how ourselves, even in the church, in the context of places like this, it's far more critical than we often acknowledge. Which is why this is resonating. Why when we talk about the soul and the dynamic of what it means and what it is and how we take care of our soul, it's why there's something that stirs up inside of us as human beings. And it's a human thing. This is not something that's unique to us in our culture. And I think that's what's really interesting. We have a tendency to always look at everything from our viewpoint. Whatever seat we're sitting at in the stadium of life, we always just see things from our view, and we think, wow, this is a really unique time to live, and it's really difficult to be a person who's aware of God and who He is, and we have souls that are alive. And what's fascinating is that has very little to do with our present circumstances. In fact, the Bible, as you read the Bible and you study the word soul and you see how many times it's used and even how it's used, what it unpacks and reveals is that the soul is something that humanity has been wrestling with for ages. This is not unique to us. This isn't something new. In fact, David wrote in Psalm chapter 42, he wrote some words that I find incredibly fascinating. In fact, there's some things I love about David in Psalm 42 that hopefully when we're done reading it here, and I just want to begin with it, I hope that there's some things about this you appreciate. Psalm 42 has some very familiar phrases in it if you've been around the church. What's fascinating is that those familiar phrases are mixed in the middle of some very unfamiliar ideas, especially as you think about our angst and our relating to God and what it is that we wrestle with in trying to be spiritually alive sorts of people. Listen to these words in Psalm chapter 42. He says this, "As a deer pants for flowing streams, so pants my soul for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God?" And I just want to pause there for just a second. This is the part we oftentimes are familiar with. Like David's writing, it's like, man, I'm hungry for God. I just thirst for Him. My soul longs for you. And what we don't see is what he says next. And look at what's causing this sort of outcry from him. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? Why? My tears have been my food day and night. And while they say to me all day long, where is your God? Like he's saying, listen, like I'm crying out this way because the tears that I'm crying, the misery of my life has me in a place where I'm saying, where is your God? Like my tears, my misery is speaking to the absence of God in my life. Then he says, these things I remember as I pour out my soul, how I would go with the throng and lead them in procession to the house of God with glad shouts and songs of praise, a multitude keeping festival. He's saying, I remember going to church. I remember gathering with people and participating with them in worship of God. Why are you cast down, O my soul, and why are you in turmoil within me? Like, what's going on? Hope in God, for I shall again praise Him, my salvation and my God. My soul is cast down within me. Therefore, I remember you from the land of Jordan and of Hermon and from Mount Mizar. You realize what he's saying? He says, my soul is downcast and I remember you. Like when my soul gets to this anxious sort of place, my soul goes back to you. Deep calls to deep at the roar of your waterfalls, and all your breakers and your waves have gone over me. By day the Lord commands His steadfast love, and at night His song is with me, a prayer to the God of my life. I say to God, my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why do I go mourning because the oppression of the enemy? As with a deadly wound in my bones, my adversaries taunt me while they say to me all the day long, where is your God? Why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you in turmoil within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise Him, my salvation and my God. I love the way that Hebrews express their faith and their relationship with God. There is this tension that exists of David knowing that there is more to what's happening in his soul than just the circumstances around him. And there's this questioning of God. There's this openness of like, God, what are you doing? Why am I in angst? Why is my soul troubled within me? But at the same moment, in the same breath of angst, David says, God, I need you. Like the fact that he's questioning, where are you, is not an expression of his lack of faith, but it's an expression of his desire because he knows that God is the one that will resolve this tension. This tension that exists in all of us. Our souls find themselves in turmoil. And the reason that we experience turmoil is really because of how our soul operates. And over the past couple of weeks, we've been talking at length about just the way that we're designed as human beings. We've talked about who we are and what the soul is. But I want to talk tonight very specifically about what your soul wants. I mentioned last week that we were going to talk about what the soul wants this week, and in the words of Christina Aguilera, next week, what the soul needs. What the soul wants, what the soul needs, and I'm not going to sing. I think I started to last week, but I'm done, right? But the soul wants certain things. And when we understand what the soul wants, it really begins to help give a way of understanding, a framework of unpacking why we experience turmoil in our life. Our soul wants three things. It truly desires three very specific things. And I want to talk about all three of them. And I just want to encourage you to maybe write some of these things down and take some notes, because they explain and help us understand so much of the life that we're living in. It's always surprising to me, and this really leads to the first thing that the soul's desiring. It surprises me some of the things that we say in our culture and what we're really saying underneath them. You know, we have these phrases, little things that we just kind of talk about with our friends or family members. And it's fascinating whenever you hear a phrase to think about what's really being said beneath it. It's interesting. Here's one that gets used all the time. When we say this, we say, I feel like my life is falling apart. Right? Anybody, you ever say that? Anyone ever say that? Like, anyone ever hear anybody say that to you? Like, I just feel like my life is falling apart. Whenever someone says that, there's like a little part of me, I look and think, what does that look like? Like, what does it look like for your life to fall apart? Like, I know what that looks like if it's my car. I know what that looks like if it's a project I'm working on. Like, I've seen things fall apart, but what does it look like for a life to fall apart, right? Like, what's going on? What are they describing when they say, man, my life's just falling apart? Or people say things like this. They say things like, I'm coming apart at the seams, right? Like, really? I didn't know we had seams, but if we did, what does this look like, right? What do you mean you're coming apart at the seams? Or people say these things, they sing these things, I'm falling to pieces, right? Like, I'm falling to pieces. What does it mean? Like, you're coming apart at the seams, you're falling to pieces, my life is falling apart. How about this one? I just can't seem to get myself together. Anyone ever hear that? What's going on when we say that? I can't just seem to get myself together. Like, I've got all these parts of my life. Like, I've got friendships and relationships, and I got my job, and I've got, maybe I've got kids, and I've got maybe education. I've got all these pieces of my life. I've got desires and hopes and dreams, and it's like this, like what are we saying when we say this? There are other phrases, we know what it means. Like, there are things like this, things like when we say somebody's lost their marbles, right? We know what that looks like, don't we? Like, that looks like some crazy aunt that shows up around the holidays, right? We know it's that uncle that kind of wanders through town. You hope that this time he doesn't stop, right? Losing your marbles, we have a way of articulating, like we can say, oh man, that's just nuts, right? But these phrases, I'm falling to pieces, I'm coming apart at the seams, what those are describing is something that's far more difficult to understand because it's soul language. This is language that's describing what's happening in the unseen part of where we are. Somebody says, I feel like my life is falling apart, and we can look around and we can see all of these different parts, and here's what's fascinating. You do, and frequently you think your life really doesn't look the way that you feel about it. What's going on in that? What's going on is that we're describing the disintegration that we experience when our soul is not whole. Our souls, and the first thing that our soul truly desires, what our soul wants, is to be whole. Our soul wants to be complete. Our soul, remember last week I talked about the reality of us being comprised of our will at the center, our mind, which is our feelings and our thinking, and then our bodies. And our soul is really what all of that is encompassed in. And what our soul is longing for is harmony between all of those things. Our soul wants wholeness. It wants consistency between those things. It wants the relationship between those things to make sense. And when we use vocabulary like, my world is falling apart, what we're describing is a sort of internal disintegration where we may not be able to point it out to anyone else, but we feel the disconnect between all of these various pieces, and we're experiencing the lack of harmony, and it's eating us alive because our soul, whether we like it or not, is always driving us. It's pushing us to a place, whether consciously or subconsciously, where it wants to be in rhythm. It wants all of your life to make sense, to be coordinated, to be synchronized. It's like the most complex musical piece that you ever imagined, like the most beautiful thing that you ever listened to. It's really interesting, and if you ever find yourself listening to very complicated musical scores, if you ever find yourself at a symphony, here's what's fascinating. When you sit down and you listen to a symphony, what you hear is the whole, all of the parts working together in rhythm, synchronized, seamlessly. And most of the time, if you can stay awake, it's beautiful, right? Like, most of the time, if I hear that stuff, I fall asleep after like 4 minutes, right? But when you listen to it, it's beautiful, isn't it? There's this amazing musical piece that's in front of you, and you think, this is so unreal. What's absolutely astounding is that whenever you remove one of those instruments from a symphony, and maybe you've been one of the people that's participated, or maybe you've had a child that practiced to be in one or whatever, whenever you remove one instrument out of that symphony and you listen to it on its own, it rarely makes sense, does it? I was talking to Adam before the morning service this morning, and I was talking about the drums, and I said, I hate it when people practice the drums, right? Like, how many of you know like you had a neighbor that had a drum set? Anyone? A brother or a sister that had a drum set? Raise your hand, right? How many of you, like, you had a drum set because some uncle hated your parents and bought you one just to punish them, right? Like, when people practice the drums, it's one of those things, you're just like, enough already. Like, the first 2 minutes, cool, you got a couple tricks, but on its own, the drums make absolutely zero sense. You're just like, what is going on here, you know? Like, I don't even know. First of all, I'm not coordinated enough to ever play that. Like, that is the most confusing thing on the planet to me. But when it's on its own, it's even more confusing. It's like, what is this, right? The drums don't make sense. Can I get an amen to that, right? Until they all work together with the other pieces, right? And then there's this beautiful thing that comes together. Adam was telling me that he was practicing for this weekend, and his wife texted him while he was practicing, and she said, I'm about to gouge my eyes out. Because that's how it feels when we're out of rhythm, right? When our will is operating in a way that is inconsistent with what we believe to be true in our mind, it feels out of sync and it eats us alive, right? When our bodies go in a direction and we give in to our cravings and we hate the decision that we've made, we're experiencing a disintegration. We're experiencing a lack of congruity, of things not being the way that they were intended to be. Our soul is driving all of the time. Our soul is wanting us to be whole. It wants all of the pieces working together. Now, that has all kinds of implications on us. All kinds of implications. But this is why the psalmist wrote these words in Psalm 103. He said, "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless his holy name." The soul is inclusive of all of life. And it wants all of life to make sense. And wholeness comes when our will is able to oversee and direct our mind. And when our mind, together with our will, can actually control the body. When things are working the way they're intended. That's wholeness. And we know what it feels like when it's not whole. Because we say things like, I'm coming apart at the seams. And we look at people that say that and we think, what do you mean? And I look at all the portions of your life and what are you saying? And we say, I don't know, just something doesn't feel right. And that's a lack of wholeness. And that's not all that our soul wants. Our soul also wants to be full. It wants to be whole. It wants to have this completeness, but it also wants to be full. Our soul wants to be satisfied. It drives us. It pushes us to experience this thing called satisfaction, right? Now, on a physical level, we know what this is like. We know what this is like, especially as it relates to hunger, right? When our stomachs are empty, we immediately have a response that says, your stomach is empty, you need to put something in it, right? Like most people don't need to be told to eat, right? Not after a certain age. Like part of being a responsible adult is that you don't have a to-do item on your to-do list every day that says eat, right? Because our body does a pretty good job of reminding us, right? It growls, it makes noises. We can actually, I will say this, the only time that we need to be told is when we get hangry, right? When we get so hungry, we get angry, and then we forget that we're hungry, and we just think we're angry, and there's some loving person in our life that says, would you please just eat, and we can talk about this later, right? That's the one exception, right? Every other time, our body says, you need to eat something, you need to put something in your stomach, you need to feel like you're full. There's something that tells you to eat, and then when to not eat. And our soul longs for that same feeling, that same experience. Our soul desires to push away from the table of life and feel satisfied. Like I don't need one more thing. Like I couldn't fit one more thing in. That's what our soul is longing for, this deep sense of satisfaction. The problem is this: no matter how hard we try, that satisfaction rarely comes. In the same way that our stomachs growl, our souls need, and our souls need more. We want more. And which is why we pursue more of so many things. We pursue more time, right? If I just had a little bit more time, then things would be better. I just need more time. And even when you get more time, you still want more time, right? We never have enough time, right? And so we buy calendars and spend money on gadgets and all these different things to try to leverage our time because we can never have enough time. The same is true of money, quite obviously, right? Like we never have enough money. And I know this is so cliche, but I'm going to say it because I think it's great to be reminded of it. I have never met anyone who got enough money where they finally just looked and said, I'm good, right? It doesn't happen. Like you can come to a place of contentedness and that's different. But most people, given the opportunity to have more money, we think, well, yeah, of course I want more money, right? Like why wouldn't I want more money? That's just an instant response for us living in our culture. There's never enough money. And no matter how much you have, you always want just a little bit more, right? You always have a reason to have a little extra. The same is true of relationships. We experience something in a relationship. We experience something good, something that's wonderful. And then we want more of that. We experience pleasure physically or sexually, and we think that's good. And so then we go pursue more of that. We ignore the law of diminishing returns, and we think if something was good at this level, then if I open it up and I experience more of it, it'll be just that much more satisfying. Or is it? See, so many categories of our life, we want more and more and more, and yet no matter how much we get, we never really seem to be satisfied, and it's because the soul needs at an endless level. The soul has needs that can rarely, if ever, be met through these means. See, we are limited. We are limited in so many capacities. We are limited in so many things. But the one area where you and I are not limited is in our desire. Like, there is nothing that stops us from desire. We're limited in our intellect. We're limited in our physical beings, in our bodies, in our strength, in our age, in our weaknesses. We're limited. We're limited in our energy. We're limited in our mortality. But there's one area where we are completely unlimited, and it's desire. We can want and want and want, and there is no limit to it. No limit. No one's stopping you. So what do? We look for things that will satisfy the soul. We want something to satisfy in the same way that food satisfies our hunger. We're longing for something that will satisfy our souls. Just give me something to make that feeling. And you know what that is, right? It may not feel like hunger, but it's really similar when it's in our souls. It's like I just need a little bit more. I just want something else. And if I was there, then I think I'd feel like everything was good. We come up with crazy phrases that are completely not in the biblical narrative. Words like soulmate. What are we saying when we say things like soulmate? What are we talking about? People say, I'm looking for my soulmate. What does that mean? Because to me, what it sounds like in the context of the soul is that we're looking for somebody who can satisfy a desire that can't be satisfied by another person. What is that that's stirring inside of us? The soul wants to be filled. The soul wants to be satisfied. And that actually complicates the third dynamic, the third thing that the soul wants, and that's to be free. The soul wants to be free. Our souls long for freedom. Our souls want our will and our minds and our bodies to be free, which is why we fight anyone and anything that try to restrict that freedom. That's why there's something that's so emotive that happens inside of us when somebody threatens our freedom, because our soul says, I should be free. And so we want wholeness, we want satisfaction, we want to be filled. That's driving inside of us. We want freedom. The question is, what happens? How do we end up where David ended up? How do we find ourselves saying, something's off and my soul is in turmoil? What leads us to that place? The answer is incredibly simple, but it is not simplistic. And there's a difference between the two. The answer is sin. That's what happened. The narrative of the Bible that describes the fall of humanity and describes us, you and I, being born into brokenness, being born into sinfulness, it describes exactly why our pursuit of wholeness and our pursuit of satisfaction and our pursuit of freedom ends in so many disastrous ways, because you and I are embedded in this story of human brokenness. The biblical narrative describes humanity as being born with, living with, you and I having to live our lives alongside of this thing called brokenness. We live with a disorientation in life, like we don't see things the way that God sees them. We're headed off in a few degrees of the wrong direction, and so we never find ourselves landing where we thought we would land. There is a disintegrating, a disorienting effect of sinfulness, of being broken as a human being. Not only that, but we have stories and we have experiences and circumstances. We have things that happen to us. We have pains that we experience and losses that we walk through, and we have expectations that aren't met. We have all of these wounds and these scars, and those wounds and those scars, they allow us to then form patterns of behavior, and we develop habits with our thinking and our minds and our bodies, and we get stuck in ruts or routines, and we begin living in a way that is consistently over and over again disoriented. We might want wholeness, and we might want satisfaction, and we might want freedom, but because of sinfulness and the damaging effects of our life and our story, it's nearly impossible for us to achieve those things. That's why, for me, the story of the fall of humanity, why this description of humanity being broken is so hopeful and so good. I know for a lot of people and a lot of individuals in the world today, they don't want to hear about sinfulness. They don't want to hear about the fall of humanity and the fact that we're broken. But for me, I need that. That's the only way this life makes sense. Like, none of it makes sense without this. Like, I can't explain to you why things in my life and other people's lives end up the way they do, how their souls can mislead them so dramatically without some sort of narrative like the fall that describes why we're broken. And so it's hopeful because at least when I understand the fall, I realize that there's a reason that we're the way that we are. At least then I understand there's something behind whatever circumstance I find myself in. Add to that the reason that story is told is to redeem us, and it becomes an even more beautiful story. Am I right? Like when you realize that this story of our fall is being told, the story of our brokenness is being told, not so that we wallow in our misery, but so that we can be rescued out of that, that's when that story becomes beautiful. That's when it becomes wonderful. Until we recognize that, though, we live in this disoriented sort of place. Our view is distorted. James, who wrote one of the books of the New Testament, he actually wrote a letter to the church at Jerusalem, so the first Christians in Jerusalem and predominantly Jewish Christians in the city of Jerusalem. He wrote this letter to the people that were in that church. And I always laugh because James always comes across as this very angry guy. And I think he was just kind of to the point. Like I always picture he was from the East Coast. Like James was like a New York or a Boston guy, right? I don't think he was mad. Like I remember one time years ago, I was lost in looking for something in New York, and I asked this guy. I said, "Hey, do you have a second?" And he goes, "Yes, but only a second, so make it quick." And I just appreciated it. It was like, okay, I'm looking for this. And he gave me the direction. He said, "Have a nice day." And it was like, "See you later," And it was like, okay, right, like fist pound, move on. I love that honesty. James, I think, has that same sort of honesty. It's like, hey, I'm not here to make you feel warm and fuzzy. I just want to speak the truth to you. But James unpacks this reality of what we experience, this disorientation, this distortion of our souls, with a really interesting word. Listen to this. James chapter 1, verse 5, he starts off this way. I want to give you the context of it. He says, "If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind." I'm just going to pause, and I know for us in our culture, we think if you doubt, question God at all, he doesn't respond. That's not what he's saying. He's saying when you ask in faith, there's an asking that you're saying, I'm reliant on God for his answers, and if I'm not, then I'm tossed around. I'm being blown like the waves on the ocean. The wind is moving me, and I'll unpack that more in just a second. But then he goes on in verse 7, he says, for that person, this is why he describes the tossing, that person must not suppose that he'll receive anything from the Lord. He's a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. Really fascinating word. This is one of those phrases where you go, double-minded, what does this mean? And actually it means more than it appears on the surface even. In fact, he uses it again in chapter 4, verse 8. Listen to what he says here. He says, draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. This is that part where he's like shaking his finger at you, and you realize, wait, no, you're not angry. Like, he's not angry. He's just telling us the truth. But listen, draw near to God, and he draws near to you. That's true. Cleanse your hands, you sinners. You're broken. Like clean it up. And purify your hearts, you double-minded. There's that word again. Double-minded. The Greek word for double-minded is diasukos. In the first week of this series, we were describing the soul, and we said the Hebrew word for the soul is the word nephesh, and the Greek word for the soul, if anyone was really taking notes, is sukos. The word for double-minded is di-sukos. What is di? It's two, right? So it isn't double-minded. It isn't that you're thinking a few things that contradict each other. He's not talking about us having some sort of battle of the mind. Well, I think about these things, then I think about these things, and I shouldn't be doing this. No, he's describing a dual-souled individual. You are di-sukos. You double-souled person. This is what makes our lives make so much sense. This brokenness, this distortion that we've experienced means that when our soul is longing to be whole, and when our soul is longing to be full and satisfied, and when our soul is longing to experience all of the things that it's desiring, when it's doing those things, that it's being driven from a dual-souled sort of place. There's a disorientation, there's a brokenness, there's a division, and we can desire things and want things that seem absolutely contradictory to each other. So in our quest for wholeness, we have this sinfulness, this brokenness, this dual-souledness, and that means that we do things, we choose things trying to be whole. We choose things that actually disintegrate our lives. We do things with our bodies and with our minds, and we do things with our lives. We spend our energy spinning out in all these different directions, and we actually disintegrate our lives rather than bring integration and wholeness to them because we're double-minded. Our bodies pursue things that our minds and our beliefs deny. And if that isn't the case, then how do you describe this little thing that we called conviction, right? I mean, conviction is the evidence that this is what happens in us. And sometimes, again, conviction is one of those things we don't love to talk about in the world today. We even in the church, we've gotten to the point of saying, well, that sounds a lot like guilt, and guilt isn't good. Conviction's good, but guilt isn't, right? But conviction is this thing that we experience when we know we've just violated the wholeness, right? Conviction is that emotion, that sense, like something's off, like I know I shouldn't have gone there, shouldn't have said this, shouldn't have done that. Conviction is when we vow, we say, man, I just want to be a different person, I want to be more loving and kind, and then we lose our temper and we blow up and we think, what's going on? What's happening inside of me? There's that sense of conviction. We make choices with our body, with our resources, whatever it is, and there's that sense of, why do I keep doing these things? That's this thing called conviction. We long for wholeness, and we just find ourselves living in all these different places. And we do things and we say something to someone like, well, that's not who I really am. Well, who are you really? Do you ever find yourself doing that? Well, I did that, but that's not who I am. Why? Because we're living out of this disintegrated place. Our search to be filled, our pursuit of more time and more money and more wisdom, all of that leads to idolatry. You know what idolatry is? Looking for satisfaction, looking for fullness in anything, anyone other than God. That's the definition of idolatry. Idolatry sounds like one of those real churchy Bible sorts of words, and you go, ooh, idolatry, like that's really, really bad, like God really hates idolatry. Do you know why God doesn't like idolatry? Because it's the most ridiculous looking thing when you see it on a human being. Case in point, people of Israel are exiting Egypt. They're wandering in the wilderness. They're on their way to the promised land. And Moses goes on top of Mount Sinai to get the law of God, and he's there a little too long. And what do the people of Israel do? They start gathering all the gold, like all the watches and bling and everything, right? And they get it all together, they melt it down, and they do something that makes so much sense. They form it into a golden calf, right? And then they worship it. Because that makes all the sense in the world, right? Because cows are awesome. And gold is great, and if you're feeling insecure, then we probably just need to go worship the gold cow, right? Like, I don't know anyone that's ever read that story and gone, wow, that makes a lot of sense, right? Like, smart people, right? Because that cow's going to get a lot done for them. No, we always look at it and go, what is that? Like, first of all, like, who decided a cow? Like, couldn't it have been a horse? Right? Like, that makes way more sense than a cow. Like, I mean, there's like just the ridiculousness of it, right? And it's idolatry. They're like finding satisfaction in this thing rather than in God. But that same sense comes to us when all of a sudden we find ourselves moving through the categories of life, worshiping a variety of things, looking for some sense of satisfaction. It's as idiotic as us worshiping a golden calf. And we do this. It's like we have this chart of life, and when we start feeling less than full, when we feel unsatisfied, we look at the chart and we start filling in the blanks, and we think, okay, well then I guess I need to have some sort of education. And so as we grow older and feel less satisfied, we pursue education and some sort of degree. And while we're in school, we start to realize that school really isn't that satisfying, but the reason I'm here is that I'm going to get that job, and that job's really satisfying. It's going to be really good. That lasts for about 18 months after you get the job, right? If you're lucky, isn't it true? And you're like 18 months into your job, and now you're like, well, I got the education, and I got the job. I probably need a new car, right? Because the job is paid for the car, so I get the car and a new place to live. But then there's this lack of satisfaction, and that's about the time you realize, I think I need a soulmate, right? And so we go find a soulmate, because that soulmate's going to satisfy the longing of my soul. And it takes about 6 months to realize that doesn't do it. The job actually has more longevity than the marriage. So we have kids, because that makes all the sense in the world, right? We look at the list and we go, okay, well, I've got the house and the car and the job. So we get the kids, and that's just a whole nother mess, right? And so we muddle along for a while, and what do? I think I should get another degree, right? And so some of us go back to school. Some of us get a new job. Some of us get a new soulmate. Some of us wish we could get new kids. No, I don't ever wish that, right? No, but you know what I mean? Like we just start replacing, and we fill and we worship these idols, and we're never satisfied. And it looks absolutely ridiculous when you're on the outside looking in, but when we're on the inside, don't you know what this feels like? Maybe there's just this thing that if I had it, I'd be whole. And ultimately, that's what interferes with the final part of what our soul wants. And that's freedom. Because these idols, they bind us. They trap us. Listen to this, Psalm chapter 24. Again, the Psalms are riddled with the conversation of the soul. The psalmist writes this in verse 3. He says, "Who shall ascend the hill of the Lord, and who shall stand in his holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart," and then listen to this, "who does not lift up his soul to what is false, and does not swear deceitfully, he will receive blessing from the Lord and righteousness from the God of his salvation." You know what he's saying? He's saying there is something that happens that you can experience from God, a blessing that is not associated with some sort of prosperity or financial gain that we think of in the West, but there is a blessing, there is a rest, there is a freedom, there is a wholeness that comes from God. When an individual avoids, I love that phrase and that picture, when you avoid lifting up your soul to things that are false. Like offering it, like taking your soul and saying, here's my life, and we throw it at these things that are false. When you do that, when you give your soul to things that are false, you find yourself simply living in bondage. How much has our pursuit of freedom really resulted in freedom? How much has our unchecked desire ever really led us to a place where we went, oh man, I finally got it all? You can look through the Bible, you see people like Samson, you just see it run rampant. King Saul in the Old Testament, you see his quest for power, it just wrecked his life. Like the rich young ruler walking away from Jesus. Like there's all these examples that we can think of in Scripture, but what about us in our life? What do we really get? Years ago, somebody really close to me, their life they were driving their life off a cliff. They were just leaving everything, leaving their family, leaving, just literally walking away from it all. And I was in a phone conversation with this person, and I just said, what are you doing? And he said, I just need to be true to myself. And in that moment, I had the wherewithal to say back to him, which self? Because you and I are dual-souled. The Apostle Paul describes it in a different way. He says there was an old flesh and a new flesh. There was an old self and a new self. And the question that I asked this person was, which self are you being true to? Which self are you listening to? When I drive, I hate going the speed limit. In fact, on the way here tonight, my daughters were getting upset with me because I was just driving a little too fast. And I realize it doesn't make them happy, but it makes me happy to drive fast. My car likes it better when I drive fast. I like it better when I drive fast. Like everything about it. Like we're like 75, 80 miles an hour. Life is good, right? Life is good. Imagine me getting pulled over, right? I get pulled over. The officer walks up to the side of the car, says, "Can you explain yourself?" Can you imagine me just saying, "Listen, man, I gotta be true to myself," right? Like there's just something in me. Like I just gotta go. Like it just felt right? Like what would he say? Press hard, 3 copies, right? Like your soul says press hard and pay the bill, right? That's what it says, right? Or this is tax season, right? I hate to remind all of you this. It's tax season. All of you that are accountants, you already know this, but those of you that aren't, you're realizing it right now. And so we're going to pay our taxes, and none of us like to pay our taxes, right? Well, imagine you just decide not to. For this year and the next year, maybe a few more years, and then the IRS shows up at your door and they knock and they say, do you realize you haven't paid your taxes? And you say, man, I had to be true to myself, and myself just said there was something wrong with paying taxes. And all of your neighbors at that point are agreeing with you, right? Yeah, there's something that just feels wrong with taxes, right? None of us line up and say, oh man, give me more. But there's consequences. Here's what's fascinating. In all of the areas where we have unchecked freedom, in all of the areas where we can think about, do whatever we want, where our world, our government, our culture protects our ability to pursue those freedoms, we have things that we can pursue with absolute, total freedom. And they don't have anywhere near the consequences of driving a car or not paying our taxes. Except for when we're honest. Because how many of us can think about things that we are completely free to do, and it can wreck our career, and it can wreck our relationships, and it can disintegrate our life, it can embarrass our children, and we're completely free to do it. Be true to yourself. Think about it this way. How many things are we completely free to do that you find yourself struggling to stop doing? Habits, behaviors, things that really maybe some people would say they're not that big of a deal. And even though you're free, you know deep down you're not. I can't get over this, even though I'm free to do it. I don't want to be. See, we're talking about genuine soul freedom, real freedom. How do we experience that? We go back to where David was. In the middle of our angst, we acknowledge that God is the only one that can make us whole, the only one that can make us full and satisfy us. He's the only one that can give us true and genuine freedom. That's it. That's what Jesus is all about. When you look at the ministry of Jesus, the 3 years that he spent preaching publicly, over and over again, we have him making all of these statements like, I came that you would have life and life to the full. If the Son has set you free, then you are free indeed. My burden is easy, my yoke is light. Like there's all of this phraseology where Jesus over and over again, every time he's talking to a group of people, it's as if he's saying, you don't have to live this way. Like you don't have to live dual-souled. You don't have to live disoriented and disintegrated. You don't have to live empty. You don't have to do this. And over again, he's telling people, I came that you'd have life. There is life. You can do this. And then towards the end of his public ministry, he begins making more and more cumulative statements about what this is all about. And one of the ones I love is in Matthew chapter 22, verse 37, where he says, you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your mind. God is where this happens, which is why the gospel is so incredibly beautiful and so wonderful. Because the gospel literally tells us that we're broken. We are daisukost. We are split-souled. The gospel says you're so broken that your life is a disintegrated mess. but you're so loved that God has done something so that you don't have to live that way. And when you and I fully embrace the gospel, when you and I say, you know what, I'm gonna literally allow the narrative of my brokenness to help define my past and shape my future, we begin to experience freedom and fullness and a sense of wholeness in our lives. When we allow the gospel to really begin to sink in, when we really begin to understand the words of Jesus, then there's this liberation, and we find what David was crying out, God, you're the only one that can do this. Would you pray with me? Jesus, tonight we're going to walk out of this place into a world that will consistently tell us that the means of wholeness, the means to achieve satisfaction, the means to achieve freedom is in some place other than you. And I simply pray that tonight, for those of us that needed a reminder, I pray that this would be an incredible reminder. And for those of us who needed to understand what this whole Christianity thing was all about, I pray that this would be a beginning of discovering the full life that you came to offer. I pray this in your name. Amen.